Hello, everybody. Welcome back. We're going to begin our second panel today about small town problem solving. My name is Art Martinez Zavada, and I'll give you a little bit of background on myself. I'm the executive director of the Texas Local Government Center. We're a new center that was founded this year. I served as mayor of the city of Von Ormy for 6.5 years. During my time there, we were able to progressively eliminate property taxes, which got quite a bit of attention at the time, and began getting calls from other communities that wanted to do the same or similar, and developed into a law practice where we began advising and consulting other cities on how to be more liberty-minded or how to achieve some of these public policy goals, which are outside of the norm. I also have a little experience in the state legislature, serving as chief of staff for State Senator Connie Burton in the 84th session and State Representative John Garza in the 82nd. While in the legislature, got to see another aspect of local government, which is the state regulation or control over local government, and began to see that there was quite a bit of a need for liberty-minded or conservative council members and cities, a place where they could go to get other models of governance, other best practices, ways to facilitate communication between each other that really wasn't present. We seem to have found a lot of isolated individual communities or individual members. Just like we heard at lunch, a lot of folks serve as minorities on their councils, and it gets very frustrating. And so, again, the TLGC formed this year to help facilitate that. We published the local government guides, which are available if you haven't picked one up on the doorway, which is some of the best practices that we put together from some of our initial membership. So if that's something you're interested in, we invite you to check us out. Our website is texaslocalgovernmentcenter.com. We're on Facebook, and we're very honored to partner with TTPF for this first local government summit, and hopefully we'll be replicating it around the state and other areas. But now let's turn to our panel. We have got a great panel for you today to talk about small city problem solving. We're going to get a little we're going to hear a little bit about some of the problems and issues that they face and how they have addressed those problems. And then we're going to open it up as an open forum to maybe you can share some of the issues or challenges facing your towns or your cities and have some dialogue with the panel on maybe some creative ways to address those. So we'll start here on the panel with Mayor Shirley Nolan. Mayor Shirley Nolan is the first mayor of Kingsbury, Texas in Guadalupe County. Kingsbury was incorporated in May of 2015, and she became the first mayor of the first all-female inaugural city council in the history of Texas. She's chairperson. She was chairperson for the steering committee that successfully led the effort to incorporate the city of Kingsbury and continues to formulate the direction of the city. She has worked the past 30 plus years in the information technology field and is currently the manufacturing IT manager in the U.S. for Continental Automotive Systems. And I know she's a proud Texas A&M Aggie. Yeah, the little Aggies at. Next we have Leonard Smith at the far end of the panel. Mr. Smith is an attorney with the law office of Leonard B. Smith. He has over 30 years, for the last 30 years, he successfully represented clients before courts, city councils, commissions, the Texas legislature, and state agencies. He's been a city attorney, but now primarily focuses on suing cities. So he'll have an interesting perspective in solving your problem through litigation. He's also a graduate of the Plan 2 Honors Program at the University of Texas, fellow graduate of mine. It's great to see another Plan 2 individual, and the University of Texas Law School. And last but not least, we have Jeff Judson, who I don't have a flyer for, so let me turn to the program. I've known Jeff for a long time. Jeff is a public policy consultant, and he served as a member of the board of directors for the Heartland Institute from 2010 to 2015. He was named as one of the most influential people in San Antonio in 2014 by the San Antonio Express News for successful efforts to block construction of a light rail system, which certainly got the attention of the paper. Justin is a former president of the Texas Public Policy Foundation And prior to his work with TTPF, Judson served as Industry Affairs Director for USAA, a $66 billion insurance and finance services organization headquartered in San Antonio. Judson is the founder of the Ownership and Land Affordability Coalition, which protects private property rights across the U.S. And Judson has served his local community as an elected member of the Olmos Park City Council. So let's give a round of applause and welcome our panelists today. So my first question, which is going to get right to the topic of the panel, which is problem solving for small towns. If you would please just give a short introduction of yourself, your background, and give us an example of a challenge or a problem that you faced in your public service or dealing with a small town in a creative way or an innovative way that you and your constituents addressed it. And we'll start with Jeff.
How many of you all represent general law cities? So cities that are under, 10,000 or? So not all of y'all are larger than that, okay. So the city of Olmos Park is a suburb inside the city limits of San Antonio. Back in the 1920s, the developers and the people that were building that community didn't like the excessive spending of the city of San Antonio, and they decided to create their own city. And I think that's an excellent idea that more of that should happen in Texas. One of the things, I guess, two of the things that I worked on. One was when I got on council, I noticed that we had all of these funds, and we had one fund called a school crossing guard fund, and the state mandates that a certain amount of your court fines go into this school crossing guard fund. Well, we didn't have a school in our city. Well, that didn't matter. You still had to have this school crossing guard fund. And so there was all this money accumulating, and we couldn't spend it, and we had to keep putting money into it. And I found out that the only way to get access to that money was for the legislature to pass a bill to relieve us of the requirement to keep putting money in it and not being able to touch it. So I asked our state legislator to pass a bill, and it goes through the local and consent calendar, which is fairly straightforward, and it wasn't that heavy of a lift, and they did that. But I encourage you all, if you see something that just makes no sense whatsoever, and that your city ought to be allowed to do something that the law prohibits, go to the legislature and ask for permission to change it. In this case, it was a fee that was already being collected, so but it was just going to sit there and accumulate and never be spent. The other thing that I worked on was getting a quiet zone put into our city, which greatly improved our quality of life. If y'all have a train going through your city and think its horn is too loud, talk to me later and I'll tell you how to maybe get around that and make that stop. But that was a great thing. We got an 8-mile long quiet zone put in. The city of San Antonio paid for about 3/4 of the cost. We paid for 1/4. But as a general law city, yeah. As a general law city, we could not spend money outside of our city limits, which I actually thought was kind of a smart thing for our city of our size. We normally wouldn't have any reason to spend money outside of our city limits, but that was another bill we had to pass, was to give us permission to spend money outside of our city limits to improve this railroad crossing. So anyway, those are my two examples.
Mary Noel?
As Mr. Spears said in the first session here, the city of Seguin did what they call stripper or finger annexations, where they only annex the asphalt, which is illegal in Texas. And unbeknownst to us, we woke up one day and we were in something called an ETJ. I couldn't even spell it when I first learned about it. And so our fight has been to get our city back from what is illegal annexation. And we certainly went to the city council, we went to the city attorney in Seguin, and he actually put his finger on the map on Kingsbury and said, that's my property. So that's what we were dealing with. That's when we decided, how do we fight this? Well, we incorporated. We incorporated what we could outside of the Seguin ETJ. And that's a fight that we certainly continue to do. Art was a big help in incorporating. That's a big step to take for a little rural community. We're widespread, farmers and ranchers. You can see by my biopic with my hat on, we're very rural. So to get us together and overcome that kind of fear of incorporating, becoming a city. We always thought we were really a city. We had been established in 1875. And, but to actually incorporate into a municipality was a big step to overcome. We still continue that fight regarding that illegal annexation, both in the court system and in the legislature. It's, as Mr. Zimmerman said, again in the first session, it's kind of a double-edged sword with TML, Texas Municipal League. I'm a member of TML. The city of Kingsbury is a member of TML. We pay dues to them. We get our insurance through TML IRP, the risk pool. We get our training from TML. And yet, when I was in the legislature to talk in front of a committee on annexation reform, which is very unusual for a city official to speak out on annexation reform, I was literally called names and jeered at by lobbyists for TML. And I'm like, paying these guys money. And here I felt like I was going to be pushed into my locker in high school, called names, an idiot, in the halls of the Capitol. While I was there, with my First Amendment rights to speak. And so it's definitely a double-edged sword. So that's one thing we're continuing to fight is the annexation reform, and sometimes against an organization like TML. Once we have,
Can I have your belt pack, please?
I can hear myself.
You can hear yourself, but unfortunately the mic is giving us trouble. Just the belt pack is fine.
Oh. Alrighty. Now, is that better? All right. Once we have done that, once we incorporate, the next thing is transitioning from a rural county area into a municipality. And doing so with what we try to incorporate into using the basic principles of a Liberty City, which is small government, low to no taxes, and limited regulations. I think that's something we all want. And in order to do that and start up a city, which is something very few people have had the opportunity to do, Art has certainly done that, and you kind of learn from others who've done so. There's not that many out there. And one of the things we've done is we very interestingly incorporated our city such that we did not take in a lot of streets or roads. The council member was talking that's one of your biggest outlays is for your fire, your police, and your roads. And for us, it's roads. And so we were very creative in our incorporation so that we did not take in any roads, or very few roads. And our subsequent voluntary annexations, we have, as a general city, we can only do voluntary annexation. We wouldn't do it otherwise. We're not that kind of city. But as we do voluntary annexations, we have so many requests. Everybody in our area has put in the petition to be voluntarily annexed. But we are very creative, or not creative, we're very selective in how we incorporate or how we take those voluntary annexations in so that we do not take on road maintenance, especially this early in our city. Last year we had, our total revenue was $4,000. We were very excited. We're better off this year. So taking on road maintenance is not something that we were able to do, and so we had to be very creative in our voluntary annexations and our incorporation for that.
Leonard?
Thanks, Art. Well, I haven't spent any time with you today, and let me understand who my audience is. Not that I've changed my remarks in any way, but how many of you are office holders? And how many of you are people who've had fusses with city governments? And how many of you are just interested in local government? Everybody. I'm a little nervous because one of my high school classmates is in the room, and I rarely speak in front of someone I went to Austin High with. And I know he does. And it goes back a little bit further than that, even back to O. Henry Middle School. So I might have to ask Scott to leave the room. Tip O'Neill, former Speaker of the United States House of Representatives, is famous for a remark that he made about government. He said, all politics is local. I bet all of you have heard of him saying that. He just didn't know how right he was, because the Greek root for politics is polis, which means city. And city government's really where I've spent my career, is the government nearest to you. And other than church politics, probably is the politics that can be most tyrannical to you. I'm not an office holder, and I never have been. I served for 12 years as a city attorney and sat on that side of the dais, advising city councils. I think I worked for 5 mayors and something like 60 different council members. And it was interesting to work with those people for 12 years. What was most interesting to me about those folks is watching the transformation that occurs with an election. I know every one of you, including those of you who hold public office today, have humbly stood in a parking lot outside of a polling place and asked your friends and neighbors for their vote. And then you've watched the tallies come in, and if you've been on the winning side of that battle, I know that each of you has felt the hand of God come down, rest on your shoulder, and endow you with powers and rights and knowledge that the rest of your fellow citizens simply do not have. It's remarkable to see the transformation that occurs, and no offense, Madam Mayor, and my fellow panelists, but it's remarkable to see what happens to folks when they are elected to public office. And so if you want to know what my recommendations are for how to deal with local government, the first thing you need to do is understand what your tools are. First of all, this room is a really good example of a tool. The best thing you can do to your neighbors who sit in judgment over matters that affect your property and your lives is to apply political pressure to them. And you do it in a very simple way in a council meeting. You fill every seat in the chamber with their neighbors so that their neighbors can watch them do to you what you don't want done to you. Every member of a city council, every mayor of a city council, particularly in a small town, enjoys being a big fish in a small pond. So the tool beyond filling the room that I think works best in moving local government in small towns is embarrassment. You need to show that what your neighbors sitting on that dais, endowed with their mighty powers, intend to do to you and your neighbors is silly. And city governments do a lot of silly things. They really do. They have provided me with a career. And my wife and children thank them for that. But embarrassment is an important tool, especially to folks who have those high powers and that high regard of themselves sitting up on that high dais. Now, the best tool that I'm going to ask each of you to think about, and I'm going to ask you to leave this room today and go back home and talk to your state representative, is changing the law. Changing the law under which cities operate. There's a huge manual called the Local Government Code. It grows and grows and grows. It's the heaviest book in my law library. I have to buy one every 2 years because the laws change. They never change in your favor. There's been a few laws that have passed that have improved your chances of dealing with cities. But what has to happen for you as citizens to deal with city government on at least an even keel basis is for the table to get tilted towards neutral again. Remember, the first thing about city governments, the principal advantage that they have over you is that they're playing with other people's money. They play with tax dollars. They're not their dollars. They don't care how they're spent. They don't spend them often wisely or well. But you don't have that luxury fighting city government. And so I'm going to talk to y'all before I leave today about a bill that didn't make it through the legislature last session. And I want you to encourage your representatives and your senators to pass this bill in the next session to give you a fighting chance against your city governments.
All right. Thank you. Jeff, I know you've done a lot of work in evaluating various forms of government and some of the advantages and disadvantages of small towns versus large towns. Maybe you can give us some insight on some of the advantages of smaller cities.
I've got a couple of slides. One of my favorite researchers is a guy named Wendell Cox, and these slides I'm going to show you come from a study he did in Ohio, and I'm hoping he's going to do one for the state of Texas. But he told me this on a phone call a while back, and it really, I thought, was very profound, that the larger a city gets, the more inefficient it gets. And as the cities are asking the state to allow them to keep and expand all of their powers, this really concerns me because when I was on the city council, every time somebody wanted to spend more money, about every $50,000 was a penny on the property tax rate. So if somebody wanted a new police car, you know, it was going to show up on people's property tax bill. Once you get it in your really big city and just millions of dollars pour in, and even just the money from the property valuations and the new construction, money's just gushing in, and it's so easy to just spend things on frivolous stuff. In San Antonio, a friend of mine sent me a help wanted ad that the city of San Antonio sent out for the for climate change, you know, manager of climate change programs, and I'm also very proud our city of San Antonio just eliminated Columbus Day. It's now Indigenous Peoples Day next Monday. But these are the kind of things big cities do when they have just all this money. So this is just the cover page of this one in Ohio, but the figures for Texas, I suspect, would look very similar. If you go to the first slide, this is expenditures per capita. So what you find is these cities under 1,000, they are missing some economies of scale. that actually get better once they get up to 5,000 range. Once you get above a population of 5,000, you start seeing how the expenditures per capita go up. And when you get over 100,000, they are 6 times what they are at the level of the 1,000. Now again, this is a per capita figure, so you'd think that it should be relatively flat, or that big cities who could buy in bulk and do things in larger purchasing pools would get economies of scale, but they just have all this money to spend and they just can't help themselves. If you go to the next slide, this is debt service per capita. Again, per capita. If you ever get large enough where you're going to have to start building roads, you may have to issue a bond or something, and you'll have some debt. But large cities, again, just can't help themselves. And I think San Antonio is number 1 in the state in the amount of debt we have. We just passed a $500 million, or was it an $800 million? The numbers are just, we have billions of dollars of debt, so you see big cities like more debt as well. And then the last slide is local taxes per capita. No surprise, the taxes go up the larger the city gets. And so I'm for the state in helping more smaller cities be created, and for more of our people to live in smaller cities where you're closer to the people, and when somebody wants a new shiny object, your neighbor sitting out in the audience who's going to embarrass you kind of makes you think, maybe we can go another year or two before we buy that new police car.
Mayor, I know Kingsbury is very unique in that it doesn't have property taxes. It's one of a handful of cities in Texas. And even among those cities, it's even more unique in that it started that way. The other cities have eliminated property taxes, but they had them for a while. So what are your biggest challenges, and what we think is your biggest benefit of having a city council who is opposed to property taxation?
Well, it is, as Mr. Judson was saying, it is small. It is easier for a small city to not make do, but to operate with a lot less money. We don't have a lot of the overhead that a larger city does, and I love these charts. It just does go to show you that the bigger the government gets, the bigger the onus on the people under that government. And as a small city, we're able to, we are certainly under the scrutiny. Every dollar that goes out, there's nothing that you can get by in our budget. The budget is so small that everything there is scrutinized. And we scrutinize it. We aren't, again, we just incorporated in May of 2015. So we are first generation city officials. We are the same people that we just came into as a city official or as a municipality. So we're the ones that were lamenting over property taxes and everything else prior to this. So we're able as a small city to really run without the property tax. We did have an election last November, and the voters passed a proposition for a sales tax. And so our revenues are much larger this year, and we actually have a little bit of breathing room. We got a lot of our money to operate prior to this from donations. We when someone's trying to sell us something or trying to come up with some way for the city to spend this money, we're like, well, that's a lot of bake sales and barbecues that we have to do in order to fund something like that. We sell T-shirts. The city of Kingsbury, I should have brought T-shirts. I should have brought T-shirts. I could have made some money for the city of Kingsbury here. We sell T-shirts. We have bake sales and barbecues. Since our sales tax we are able now to have some breathing room and be able to pull back from that a little bit. But every dime that we spend, because our budget is so small, is that nothing gets by. Nothing gets by. There's no sliding anything under the door on that. So your numbers are absolutely representative of what I've been experiencing, is that as a small town, you do have smaller expenses, and we're able to get by without any property tax. And there is probably the fewer economies of scale there, but we're certainly learning. We're certainly learning.
You know, for any of your cities that have a sales tax and a property tax, state law allows you, if you have any room left in your sales tax, to increase it. State law allows you to increase your sales tax for the purposes of reducing your property taxes. It's just a one-for-one swap. And I think consumption taxes are better than property taxes economically, and something you ought to pursue. Hopefully your city hasn't already used up all of its taxing ability, and most of them have, because it's just money left on the table. They just can't help themselves.
Yeah, we did go for the 1.5% that we were allowed to do, and a lot of that has to do with if there's another taxing entity that comes along, a library district or some other kind of taxing district can come along and get that 1.5%, we would forever be out of that revenue. Mm-hmm. And so we did go for the 1.5%. Mm-hmm.
Okay, we'll have one last question for Leonard, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. But Leonard, you had mentioned that you had a legislative proposal. If you can explain to us what would you think would be the best thing the legislature could do to help people fight City Hall?
Well, first of all, understand that when cities are fighting you, they're using your money against you. Most of my clients, at some point in the process, usually pretty quickly in the process, understand that they have to write checks from their own checkbook, and it's personally painful to pay for the fight. The pain is compounded by the fact that I can only look at my client and say, under current law in Texas, you're either entitled to no attorney's fees, or you're entitled to recover discretionary attorney's fees that are awarded to you if a judge wants to give them to you. It's a lopsided battle that's fought. In the last legislative session, the legislature passed House Bill 1704, which relates to Chapter 245 in the Local Government Code, and we lawyers patted ourselves on the back about that. And I actually got it out yesterday because I was at a meeting talking about that statute, and I want you to know that all it does is say this. I've got to find my glasses because it's too small for me to read. A court may award court costs and reasonable and necessary attorney's fees to the prevailing party in an action under this chapter, Chapter 245. Chapter 245 is the vested rights statute. It doesn't really use the words vested rights, but that's what it's about. It's a shorthand way of saying it defines the rules under which any of your properties or projects can be judged. But I don't like this statute. The word may is soft. It's a word of discretion. And too many judges simply will deny you, if you've won, the ability to recover the costs and fees that you've incurred to prove your point to your local government. And so I like the word shall. And there was a statute in the last legislative session, SB 635. Oh gosh, I was praying for this one. It died in the House Calendars Committee, passed the Senate, and just didn't make it to the House floor in time.
Darn.
But it used the magic word shall. And shall is an important word because as much as I'm respectful to judges who sit in judgment over my case, I want them to be able to award my clients fees if we beat the government. And so shall is better than may. So please, all of you who are taking notes, write down SB 635. Go home and call your representative. Go home and call your senator and say that you expect him or her to carry or sponsor that legislation in the next session, to give you a fighting chance to defend your rights in the courts where they're supposed to be defended. Because you're not playing with other people's money, you're playing with yours.
You know, one reason I think that legislation would be very helpful is that, Art, I find that cities now, and they really don't feel constrained by what the law tells them they can or cannot do. They just do it. And if somebody wants to say you can't do that, then fine, sue us. And the worst thing that happens to them is the judge says you can't do that anymore. And so 9 times out of 10 or 99 times out of 100, they get to do whatever they want. And at 1 out of 100, somebody makes them stop. And it's really, I just see a lot more lawlessness taking place where they just really, the law doesn't really restrain them at all.
Well, let me put my city attorney hat back on and tell you that not only do cities play with other people's money, they always have the advantage of time. It's hard for a property owner or a project developer to wait. I had to counsel a client yesterday in Dallas who's struggling with a law that involves preemption of local control. And the city of Dallas simply continues to regulate. Mm-hmm. It's a dare. The cities all across the state, in every corner and quadrant of the state, will simply make you sue them. And lawsuits take a long time. Roger Borgelt's back there at the end of the room, and Roger and I worked on a case. Roger, I think that case started in, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago. And what happened in that case, just so, and I'm gonna talk lawyer language here, we had a city that challenged the jurisdiction of the court as what's called a dilatory plea. Well, a dilatory plea is about delay. And delay cost 4 years. That issue had to be tried in the trial court and appealed to the appellate court and won in the appellate court in order to establish the right to sue a city for a wrong act. Now, I'm going to tell you the one great thing about Chapter 245. So when you go back and talk to your representative and your senator, this is good. 245 waives that right. It allows suits. It denies the city the ability to challenge the jurisdiction of the court when you're arguing about what rules apply to your property. It's the one good thing, one of the best things in Chapter 245. And we need more of that in the state to tilt the tables so they're fair. Not so that you're advantaged, but so that the tables are fair.
That could be transformative.
All right, well, we'll take some questions from the audience. Okay. We got one over here, and we got a question up in the front.
This question is for Mr. Smith. You've been talking about SB 635, and I follow the legislature pretty closely. I almost recall some debate on the House floor regarding something similar to that. Do you know if that was proposed as an amendment to another bill during the session?
I pulled the legislative history yesterday and on 635, and what it shows me is that the report was sent to calendars on 5/20 and was never reported out of calendars. So there must have been some discussion on the floor at some point in the process.
That's really late in this session. So.
It's very late in the session. It passed. The bill passed out of the Senate on May the 8th, so there was plenty of time. Yeah. But look, TML has lots of power at the legislature, and a tag will stop a bill.
Especially in the House.
Yes, and there's only one way to pass a bill. There's a whole lot of ways to kill it.
Right. I guess a second part of a different question actually is relating to, there was some effort during the special session, and we've seen, I think, bills in other regular sessions that would propose to limit local government spending to growth in population plus inflation. That bill didn't really make it out of even the Senate during the special session. I understand there were a lot of issues that local government officials had with that bill and with the idea generally. So do you guys, any of you for that matter, have any issues or disagreements with local government spending limits in line with population and inflation?
That sounds like it's for you.
Yeah, and you know, if I'm not mistaken, there's never been a spending limit. It was simply that it would trigger a rate rollback election. So you had to do things that the people supported. And I know the people of Almus Park and the people of San Antonio I've seen them vote bond issues up. I've seen them vote them down. I've seen them vote against light rail twice. So the people are pretty smart. Like you said, you know, even though once you become elected, your intelligence does double, you know. No, the voters are actually pretty smart, and it just triggers that rollback election. And I heard a lot of times during the session about how this was going to just be devastating for cities because they wouldn't be able to, you know, of course, hire police or firemen because they'd have no money. And it's just, no, you just have to tell the people this is what we're going to spend the money on, and if they're okay with it, then they'll vote yes, and I think they would.
Absolutely. We have a question here in the front, and then. Yeah, I think if they were spending them on police and fire, they probably wouldn't have an issue.
They wouldn't have a problem.
That's not what
No.
they're spending it on.
In legal matters, I'm always a proponent of going on the offensive. Are there any nice little loopholes for the citizens in the statutes where we could take a specific action where we're in the position of, say, so sue me, in that they want to move the suit along fast because they're on the defending position?
Well, I've got a case that's pending right now here in Travis County. My client is a statewide association, and we sued 15 or 16 cities in our first iteration of that suit. We've managed to settle with 15 of the 16 cities in the first 4 months of the case. That's an unusual result, and it's because the association managed in 2011 to have a preemption statute over its industry enacted. It's the Propane Gas Association, and the section is section 113.054 of the Natural Resources Code. The association also took the time to invest in an Attorney General's opinion process. So we've armored that case as well as it could be prepared. Sure, I think going on the offense is often good, but unless you have the time and the money to do what that association did, to prepare your case wisely and well so that you have the opportunity to be aggressive, offensive, and win, that's important. Too often, the problem with being aggressive and offensive in the courthouse with respect to cities is that you have an immediate jurisdictional challenge, which has to be litigated at the trial court level and then and settled on the appeal, where the appellate court's got to tell the trial court judge he's got jurisdiction to hear the case. So there is I wish it was easier to sue cities, and not because it ought to be a growth industry. I understand the concerns about that, but because the tables are tilted so far against you, the citizens and the property owners, that there's almost no way to win.
What about a mandamus suit? Aren't those could be pretty cheap and efficient, can't they?
So 245, the chapter in the local government code that we're talking about, authorizes a declaratory judgment action, an injunctive relief, or a mandamus action. I've filed a suit under 245 in July, and in that suit we are seeking a declaratory relief, and we've reserved the right to seek injunctive relief or mandamus. A lot of trial court judges using the Declaratory Judgment Act assume that city councils will do the right thing once the court tells them what the right thing to do is. The problem is, I think, playing with other people's money makes you brave. And so what I perceive is that cities are becoming less likely to follow the directive of a court in a declaratory judgment, so that you need to take more aggressive and adversarial action. You need to seek that injunction, or you need to seek a mandamus in order to get the city to do what it's supposed to do. What does that do? That ratchets the temperature up. It makes it a harder fight. It makes it a more expensive fight. And you have to think carefully before you spend your money at the courthouse, because it's awfully expensive to fight a city.
And just for clarity, we have a question over here, and then we'll come back. A mandamus, for those you don't know, is a court order ordering a public official to perform a certain act or a certain duty of
That
their
they're
office.
required to do.
That they're required to do that by the court, yeah.
So it's just them telling, follow the law, do what you're supposed to do anyway. And,
But with an injunction, you have a mechanism of enforcement.
Yeah.
Where you don't with a declaration. So.
Yeah, I mean, that's, you're talking about taking it to law. That was part of our frustration, that a city can do something totally illegal, can do what we called annexed up the asphalt. Only annex the asphalt, and less than 1,000 feet wide. There is no overriding entity anywhere that says that you're not allowed to do that, you can't do that. You have to take it to, you have to be in legal action. Mm-hmm. And we incorporated in order to be able to be go city to city, with them. And we shouldn't have had to do that. Mm-hmm. There should be some kind of a way to better sue a city than incorporate yourself, to fight them city to city. Or there should be, in my opinion, there should be some kind of entity that says, that there's entities out there telling me I can't do something or other, as a person. There should be something out there that says a city, okay, this was bad, you have to pay, some kind of fine and don't do that again, but there's not.
In the last 2 sessions, the legislature has grappled with that idea. I've heard it expressed in this way. And listen, everyone in here I know would nod your head and say, local control is a good thing. Listen, there's no difference in the tyranny of local control or state control or federal control. Tyranny is tyranny. Mm-hmm. The question, I think, for each of us as citizens and for each of you as landowners or people who are interested in how local government works is whether or not the regulation is occurring at the right level of government. For example, I represent the Propane Gas Association. That industry is regulated at the federal level, it's regulated at the state level, it is regulated on scientific consensus under codes that are approved internationally. And yet we have Billy Bob Fire Marshal in Bowie, Texas deciding that there's no way in heck that he's going to allow something to occur in his city that is 5 times the restrictions that are required under international law. Well, that's just silly. There is no scientific or rational basis for that to occur. So in the case of our statute, the legislature decided that because our industry is regulated at the federal and the state level, that's where the regulation ought to lie. So in 2011, the legislature passed a preemption statute saying that the rules that are adopted by the Road Commission control. Now, do you know that 6 years later, we're still fighting with Houston, Dallas, Austin? They cannot understand a 68-word statute. And it requires a group, an association that has statewide reach to contend with cities like that. You individually don't have a chance. So change the law to give yourselves an opportunity to fight fair in the courtroom. Be your best hope as free citizens.
I would like to ask about the alphabet agencies. I'm recently elected councilman in a small home rule city, and we have an EDC, we have an MDD, we have a TDD, we have TIFs and TERS, and it seems that the economic development that occurs seems to be mostly the economic development of the friends of the members that sit on these boards. Mm-hmm. Is there anything that we can, pending legislation, that can be done to introduce transparency and some sort of control over these appointed boards?
boy, these tax incentives have got to be reined in. They're in the fight over light rail in San Antonio, we pointed out that wherever they build these light rail systems around the country, they always point to the economic development that it creates. Well, The Cato Institute did a research study that showed that the economic development is a result of tax subsidies around all of those transit stations. So and when there were no tax subsidies, there was no development. So when you subsidize something, you get more of it. And you can see, there's some areas of San Antonio that look better today than they did 15 years ago because you've subsidized wealthy developers to build apartments that now wealthy people are renting. But is that really, we need to be taking money away from the rest of the city to subsidize these wealthy developments? Now we're subsidizing in San Antonio developments to move something from one part of the city to another part of the city that the politicians like better. So, and then the county is giving subsidies to keep a company from moving just over the county line. So you're still within the living area of San Antonio. It's still the economic market of San Antonio. But because it's going to be 5 miles down the road, the county's going to subsidize them to not move. And it's just, it really needs to be reined in, and it's becoming very economically irrational.
Sir,
So TPPF needs to draft some model legislation and get that done.
the alphabet soup you referred to, TIF's tax increment financing, TIR's tax increment reinvestment zone, the zone in which TIF financing occurs, public improvement districts, public planned unit developments. There's so many acronyms that you'd think that those acronyms were designed to obfuscate what's really happening from the people who live in those cities, and probably that's the truth. One thing you can and should do is make regular inquiries about whether or not there are any business arrangements occurring between office holders and the people who are receiving the benefits they bestow. There's a conflict of interest statute in Texas, and it is a crime to have a benefit that you receive on the basis of a vote. And the benefit can be tangential, but it can be related. And if it is, that's something you and your fellow office holders ought to pay and your citizens in your community ought to pay very close attention to.
When I started working in the legislature last century, local control was the conservative objective, where it was local control, the decision was made locally, and there's already been some discussion in previous panels on the virtues of local control, of people that know the community and so on. Fast forward 20 years later, local control comes with a host of problems, especially with regard to property rights, economic freedom, and individual liberty. Mm-hmm. And so the principle of local control certainly it's not as good as it used to be for conservatives 20 years ago. What should be the balance that the legislature needs to strike between conservative interests of protecting property rights, economic freedom, and individual liberty versus preserving local control? I mean, what should the legislature be considering here when it comes to these types of questions?
Oh, please, can I go first? Rewind 20 years or 30 years. I want you guys this is a question from me to you. What is the purpose of zoning? Is zoning, I'm going to give you, it's going to be an A or B. Is zoning designed to ensure that compatible land uses sit adjacent to one another? Or is zoning intended to be top-down management, dictated development? Now, that's a leading question, I admit. But what's the answer?
B's the wrong answer.
B's the wrong answer. The true answer is A. For those of you who live in or around Austin, look at Code Next. This is not zoning. It's social engineering. Zoning is about whether or not use A belongs next to use B. It's not about whether the government should dictate whether A or B should be on those tracks. It's whether the uses A and B fit next to one another. Zoning has been twisted into something that it was not intended to do. It was so bad 20 or 30 years ago that the legislature came up with a new tool called comprehensive planning. And the reason for comprehensive planning was to try to reinforce what zoning was intended to do, to protect uses from one another or to align compatible uses. Now what comprehensive planning has become is the tool that gives you code next. It is top-down dictated land use. That's what code next is. That's what comprehensive planning has become. And both have polluted the original purpose of zoning, which was only to ensure that houses sat next to houses.
I think
Yes,
Governor
sir.
Abbott, 3 or 4 years ago at a TPPF event, raised this issue of local control, and he said that, you know, under the federal Constitution, all power is granted to the states except for those enumerated powers given to the federal government. At the state level, all power is granted to the state with certain limited powers that are given to the cities. But under home rule, we've just basically said for many, many years, cities, if you want to do it, you basically just go for it. And the state and the federal constitutions were written to preserve life, liberty, and property. And I think that if a local ordinance violates life, liberty, or property and erodes your property rights, and that's what's happening a lot more often, that they should be prevented from doing that. And so it's very simple. We just need to adhere to our state and federal constitutions and start looking at things through that lens of violating property rights. You know, in Almas Park, we had a proposal to start having, we had zoning, but they wanted to institute design regulations so that before you could build a house, you had to go get the design approved. Well, you know, I said, show me a house that you would not have wanted built somewhere in Almas Park. There was no example. They were all nice houses, and they did it without any prior approval. But my rule of thumb is, if somebody's going to build something next to you that reduces your property values, then you should have an action against that. But most of the time, it's just a matter of somebody's taste. You know, it isn't going to really hurt their property values. It might even help them. In fact, some people complain that something's going to be built and it's going to make the neighborhood more expensive, and their property taxes are going to go up because everybody's values are going to go up, which actually should be kind of a good thing. But if it's not going to hurt your property values, then it's probably okay. If it is going to hurt it, maybe the government can step in.
Well, that's not what the law is in Texas. And the problem with that is we can aspire to follow the Constitution and state and federal, but that train's left the station. And the problem with zoning is when you have a dictated land use by a city, it imposes on the property owner a choice. He or she can either accept the dictated land use or try to fight. The problem with fighting is this: it's only a compensable injury if you're involuntarily upzoned. If you're involuntarily downzoned, if you're involuntarily upzoned, it's not a compensable injury. So the first thing I think that the legislature could look hard at is, how does comprehensive planning and zoning fit together? Rather than let zoning or comprehensive planning combined with zoning dictate a land use, it ought to be that a property owner can put use A next to use B because those are the defined uses that go together. There has to be some compelling reason, stronger than public health, safety, or welfare, that denies two compatible uses the ability to sit next to one another. I've written statutes that have been considered in the past. They don't go anywhere. TML kills them, but it really is. If you read the purpose of zoning, in chapter 211 in the local government code, and you read the purpose of comprehensive planning in chapter 213 in local government code, you will find nowhere in there that it was designed to deny the development of property. That's not what it's for. And so somehow the legislature's got to grapple with that issue, looking at the purpose of those tools and getting them back to what they were, or scrap them.
Good idea.
All right, do we have any other questions?
I guess he preempted you. Hi, speaking of zoning, I guess I've been hearing people talk about Hurricane Harvey, that if there had been zoning in Houston, there may have been more coordination and less impervious cover, which would have made, which made the flooding perhaps worse. And I was just wondering if you could discuss that aspect of zoning and whether, what's the argument against that?
So zoning, the power that supports, zoning was created in the 1920s. There is a comprehensive federal statute drafted by the Commerce Department, I can't remember the name of it, that created zoning. And the idea behind it was that there should be compatible uses, one next to the other. The power that supports zoning is the police power. I mean, you hear it in Texas stated in this way: this is for public health, safety, and welfare. I don't really know what Code Next has to do with the purpose of zoning, like uses next to one another. But if you think about public health, safety, and welfare, you ask yourself whether or not there was something the city of Houston could have done under that broad power, using the tool of zoning, that would have changed development such that the city would have survived a 500 or 1,000 year storm. The reality probably is that there wasn't much that could be done, because Houston's flat and wide, and water's going to go somewhere. So the power that's about zoning is one that cities always point to: public health, safety, and welfare. And if there have ever been words misused more than any other words I've heard in my career in the last 30 years, those are the words that have been misused.
And city planners hate Houston. It drives them crazy that a city that is as functional and successful as Houston could get away without having this giant code of zoning ordinances. And it works quite well in other cities. Of course, nobody's emulating that because they'd just as soon Houston not exist in that regard. But more cities ought to try not having zoning. By the way, there's a guy, if you're interested in the zoning issue, a guy named Randall O'Toole with the Cato Institute has done more writing and publishing on the issue of planning and zoning than anybody I know. And it's even worse than you think once you read a lot of his research. It really reduces the quality of life of thousands of people around the country.
And in Texas, the treatise is Mixon. M-I-X-O-N, is a professor at SMU. M-I-X-O-N.
Well, actually, I'm from Houston, and I'm really glad that there's no major zoning. In fact, that's why it's one of the most affordable cities in the entire nation to live in, affordable large cities. But my question is primarily for Mayor Nolan. I am from Houston, big liberal Houston, and
I lived in Houston for about 7 years at one time.
Oh, okay,
Yeah,
so you're-
yeah, I know it pretty well.
you may know where this question is coming from. It's like Houston, even though it doesn't have much overall zoning, it's world famous for just gobbling up, Clear Lake.
COH.
There
We
you
call
go.
it the COH, City of Houston. Yes,
But-
COH is absolutely famous for gobbling up everything around it.
And so I guess my question is, it's like, but Seguin is not Houston, and so weren't there some conservatives in Seguin that would have, presumably would have thought, well, why are we doing this to the area of Kingsbury? I mean, I guess the values of the members of the people who live in Seguin, would they have not, alerted them to, like, gee, why are we doing this to the folks in Kingsbury?
Yeah, they have been asked that several times. Why don't you just let my people go? let Kingsbury go. Why don't you just let Kingsbury go? And I've had meetings with the mayor and city council and the city planner, and they were like, two things. Well, we need to be able to control the area. I'm like, well, I don't want you to control me. What is this with the control? We need to be able to control this. The other thing is they're scared of San Marcos and New Braunfels. They're like, well, if we don't take this, San Marcos and New Braunfels are they're ETJs. I'm like, well, you're doing to us what you say you don't want them to do to you. And so it makes no sense to us at all. So it's going to be a long fight. But I mean, our whole downtown is part of the Seguin ETJ. And they did it right at Christmas, 2013. Nobody was paying attention. Nobody knew about it. Nobody in Kingsbury. They're 10 miles away. 10 miles. And for, COH, that's no big deal. But for small cities like this, 10 miles is huge. And we had no idea. Nobody was paying attention to what Seguin City Council was doing. Nobody knew until months after it was already done. So it's certainly something that has been put to them. They get rather defensive about it now because it's been put to them so many times. Why don't you let Kingsbury go? And now it's kind of a matter of spite, maybe, that it's been put to them so many times. South of Seguin, there was an area that went to a vote for incorporation this past May, and went down in flames. Mostly because there was this one person who's a gym buddy of the mayor of Seguin, and he led that fight against incorporation, and he drug me personally and Kingsbury through the mud and put so many lies and spins out there about what would happen if they incorporated, that it just scared the people. It scared the people horribly out there, and they ended up thinking that they wouldn't be able to shoot their guns on their own property. He told them that they would have to have a property tax, that they would have to have, all these taxes and all these regulations on them. And it was so not true, but he was able to spin that very well. In retaliation for Kingsbury supporting them, Seguin came back and said, oh, by the way, Kingsbury, we want you to pay us $4,200 a year for ambulance service. It's right there in our budget for all to see that our income was $4,000 a year at the time. They said they had 17 calls to Kingsbury in the year. I met with the Seguin Fire Marshal and the county EMS coordinator. Went through all the calls. They couldn't tell me exactly which addresses because of HIPAA rules, but they could give me a road and I could tell them what addresses were in the city of Kingsbury. None of them were a call to Kingsbury. They said, well, we have a 2.5 miles of I-10 are in the Kingsbury city limits. Well, they had 7 accidents on I-10. So, well, if those 7 were in those 2.5 miles of I-10, I'd say that those are the most dangerous 2.5 miles from Florida to California on I-10. They couldn't give me a single call. I brought all this to them. They said, we don't care, $4,200 a year it is. And it was very much in retaliation for us supporting those people south of Seguin because the other towns in the county had never paid them EMS services, for EMS services. Suddenly, they came and said, Kingsbury, you have to pay. Oh, and these other towns, too, that have never had to pay, you have to pay, too. So it's become a very much of a contentious situation between our cities. And they've got control of that area, and they're just not going to let go, not without an overriding, not without the court telling them that they can't.
All right. Well, we have room for one last question, as long as it's quick, and then we'll have to wrap it up.
I was in the earlier session this morning. There was some discussion about what the Attorney General Mike could be doing on this front to maybe take some of the burden off of the property owners and locals. I was wondering if you could comment on maybe what we could be asking of the Attorney General, who ought to be kind of favorable to property rights.
Well, I think one of the most important powers that the Attorney General can exercise is something that's an advisory power. Attorney General has an opinions committee. So the opinions committee is not designed to opine on matters of fact. In other words, there can be a factual basis for a question, but the opinions committee is not there to parse the facts and decide which facts are right or wrong. But what the opinions committee can do is give you a read on the law. The law is helpful in this sense. The case we have pending for, or I have pending for the Propane Gas Association, we obtained an Attorney General's opinion, getting the Attorney General's opinion on what the law was before we filed the suit. So we're able to go to court, say, here's the statute, here's an Attorney General's opinion. I combine them together in a petition and say, all right, Judge, what do you think? Now, here's the interesting thing about Attorney General's opinions. They're not law necessarily recognized by a court. But because the Attorney General is who he is, the office has the right to be respected, given due deference until a court that can issue an opinion, an appellate court, tells us that the law is otherwise. So I would use as often as I can the Attorney General's process to buttress my view of what the law is. And the legislature has given us that tool in other areas. When you file a public information request, there is, in effect, sort of a short-circuited opinions process that a city can go through in order to try to deny you information. And it's sort of like an Attorney General's opinion process that goes through the Opinions Committee, except it's handled by the Open Government Group. Those opinions are issued usually within 3 or 4 months. The Attorney General's opinion statute says the opinion must be issued in 6 months unless the Attorney General explains the need for an extension. So it's a quicker way to get a read on the law rather than just having me look at it. Let the Attorney General opine on it. You can get it in a fairly defined period of time. The best thing you can do about setting up an Attorney General opinion is asking the right question. And you have to have the right person ask the right question. It has to be a committee chair in the House or the Senate who invokes the Attorney General's opinion. So you need to be able to present a case to your local representative, your local senator, to help you get a read on the law. And I don't think they're hesitant at all to assist you in doing that. It's good constituent service. You're not asking anything of them other than to help you find out what the law is. So it's like giving you the sleeves off a vest. It ought to be pretty simple.
Okay. Well, we're out of time, and just want to like to remind everybody that today's third and final panel is entitled The New Local Government Landscape, and it will start at 3 p.m. in this theater. Let's give our panelists a round of applause. And we'll take a short break and see everyone at 3. Thank you.